Good evening, friends. On behalf of Untitled Delhi Chapter, I welcome you all to this Facebook Live lecture series. Today we have Rahman, who is going to talk about Delhi's modern architecture with a special focus on the buildings of Habib Rahman. Really requires no introduction. He is a noted contemporary Indian photographer and curator. He is one of the founding members of Samat. Ram completed his degree in physics and went on to get a second degree in graphic design from the Yale University School of Art. Today, Ram is recognized as a renowned architectural photographer. He has shown his photographs in individual and group shows in India and across the world. Ram received the prestigious Forbes India Art Award in 2014 for the best exhibition of Indian art curated on an international stage. Ram has also authored a couple of books: Sunil Jana, Photographs 1940 to 1960, The Samat Collective, Art and Activism in India since 1989, and Defending Hussain in the Public Sphere, The Samat Experience. And now over to Ram.
Thank you, Annabelle, and thank you, Swapna, for your help. I hope that you can hear me. This is the first time I'm doing a Facebook Live event, and the broadcast seems to have a few seconds or a minute and a half of delay. This talk actually emerged from a request to do a talk on the Central Secretariat of New Delhi. And I really felt that I didn't really have very much to say given the debates that are going on currently about the whole redevelopment project. But I thought I will bring in some aspects of that issue, really in the context of the work that my father did in New Delhi in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s as a central public works department architect. He spent his whole life in public service, unlike many architects who had initially joined government service. And I'll begin with a little bit of background, and I'm going to read a couple sections from a very fantastic interview which was done by Molloy Chatterjee, former professor at the School of Planning and Architecture, a set of interviews which were done in 1989 with my father. I'm going to read out and I'm showing you this rare picture, aerial picture of Delhi, which was sometime in the late 20s or early 30s, where you see the wall of the city still intact on the southern edge, which was broken actually after independence. And on the extreme right, you can see Delhi Gate in the corner, the lower corner. This is a quote from my father. In 1931 to 1941, after completing my mechanical engineering degree at BE College, I came to Delhi for 1 week in 1939 to sit for a competitive exam for the railway service. That's roughly what Delhi looked like at the time, at least the old part of the city. I stayed with a cousin on Babar Lane. The area abutting the railway line had only single-storied developments, 2 rooms, front and back veranda, and a back courtyard accommodating a detached kitchen and bathroom. I was busy studying for the exam most of that week and hardly saw the city. I traveled by Tanga to the old Secretariat to take the exam, which happens to be just up the street from where I live now on the old Alipur Road, now known as Shamnath Marg. My only other excursion was to the Qutub Minar, also by Tonga. Connaught Place was fully developed, even Scindia House had been built. I had only an amateur's interest in architecture those days. So this was his first view of Delhi, and it's crucial to understand that he comes from Calcutta, which, like Bombay, was a very large British urban development. It was an urban center, it was a flourishing city, unlike Delhi, which here you see the Mughal medieval city, and the New Delhi, which was being built by the British. He didn't get into the railways, thank God, and went back to Calcutta, but got a West Bengal government scholarship for a Muslim student of engineering to go to MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts. This is 1939. At MIT, this is him in the architecture studio because he shifted from engineering to architecture because he got frightened of the maths. At least that's what he related years later. At MIT, he studied with professors both at MIT, but one of his major influences was a professor from Harvard, which was Walter Gropius. And Gropius, of course, had been the founder of the Bauhaus in Germany in 1919. Last year was the centenary celebration of the founding of that school of modern design and architecture. And Gropius had fled, along with many other teachers, artists, performers, professors, to England and the US after the Nazis rose to power and Hitler shut down the Bauhaus in 1933. Luckily, most of them escaped with their lives. This is a model of a building done by my father at MIT. Give an idea of the kind of architecture that he was being taught to espouse. He found the whole socialist approach of Bauhaus modernism very appropriate for India that he had come from, which was just about to emerge from colonial rule. The freedom movement was at its height. We were about to get freedom with the British finally leaving. So 1944, he graduates with a master's degree in architecture, having done a bachelor's degree a year before, 43, both at MIT. And then Gropius hires him to work with him and Konrad Wachsmann, who was another German expatriate, though not from the Bauhaus, in Cambridge and in New York. Gropius had set up a company to manufacture prefabricated housing. And you see this building, which is a building that my father worked on. This is from 1944 to 1945 during the war. And these were being built as trial buildings for the US Army to be shipped all over the world. Another view. In New York, besides doing architecture as a young student, my father was now 30 years old. He found my grandmother, who was an American who had done Indian dance and had got stuck in New York during the war. Joined her dance troupe because he had a striking body, as you can see. And he started dancing in her troupe in New York, along with doing his architecture. And that's where he met my mother, who you see over there. My father was 30 and he ran away. He eloped with my mother, taking her out of high school. She was 15 years old. And they come back to India, fleeing my grandmother. He comes back and joins the Central Public, well, not the Central, but West Bengal PWD. And one of the first projects he gets is the first memorial to Mahatma Gandhi, which was at Barakpur, Gandhi Ghat, which was finished in 1949 for the anniversary, first death anniversary of Gandhi, who had been assassinated in January 1948. Now, you saw the model of the building that he had done at MIT, but here he comes up with a structure which is quite different from that kind of work, because he was trying to evoke the spirit of Gandhi. And though my father came from a Muslim background, he was actually quite an anti-religious atheist, and denounced any religious mullahs or priests or godmen his whole life. But he came up with this structure which evoked a couple different religions, with the Hindu shikhar topped with a Muslim dome on the top, and that cantilever evoking a Christian cross when you see it from the river, from the boat, and its reflection in the river. Nehru had come to open this, inaugurate this memorial. It was, as I said, the first, and he loved what he saw. Now, my father's just, 30 something years old. This is his first project. Nehru asked to see the architect. He said, "Who has designed this?" And that's where he met my father, at that ceremony of the opening. And when he heard about his background, he said that, "I have to get you transferred to Delhi, to the Central Public Works Department, because we need architects like you as professionals." Remember that there were only 3 schools of architecture at independence, at the time of independence in India, and not a very large number of trained architects. Many of them had been trained in Bombay at the JJ school under British training, and many had worked under Lutyens and his whole team of British architects at the fag end of the building of New Delhi. And some of them had remained in the Central Public Works Department. The other big building project that came into my father's hands was really where he was able to express his full Bauhaus modernist ideals. And this was the new Secretariat building in Calcutta, finished in roughly 1954, started 1949. This was the first big steel frame, tall structure in India. And during this talk, I'm going to talk quite a bit about design elements in my father's work. One of the things in India's design history over the last many decades, the Public Works Department has always been derided, particularly by private architects or name architects who became quite well known internationally. And my father always resented that. He said, because there was some very good work which was done by public architects and by the government departments. And an example of this was this building, which became matter of huge pride in Bengal. And I'm going to read from a wonderful book, which I hope many of you know of. It was a book on India's modern architecture called India, Modern Architectures in History. This is a series which was published by Reaction Books in the UK in 2015. And it was authored by Peter Scriver and Amit Srivastava. And it's a wonderful book because it talks particularly about that period, but brings in really political perspective on what's happening with politics, with social change at the time. I'm just going to look for that passage on... This was another major project in Bengal. This was the Bengal Engineering College, which was finished in about 1955. And again, you can see that this has the hallmark of that very classic Bauhaus kind of structure. Remember, this is a time when there is not a lot of money to construct buildings like this in India. So it was done, fairly simply. But you can see the fenestration and the kind of detailing that my father used to give a simple building a little bit of aesthetic interest in the use of different chhajjas, how light and shade worked, the use of glass. We didn't have a lot of large glass. I'm just trying to find that particular passage on. Anyway, let's go on. So this is the Delhi, as I said earlier, that my father comes to. And just to give you an idea of what Delhi really was like, because many young people probably don't remember it. This was roughly 1933. This is an aerial view of Central Vista, which is being discussed so much recently. But look at how barren that part of Delhi was. This is the south of the old city. You can see the two Secretariat buildings by Baker and the Parliament building by Baker have been completed. And in the back is Rashtrapati Bhavan by Lutyens, and a couple of the other buildings in the compound of the president in the back, the stables and the band houses, etc., which were also done by Lutyens. But interestingly, look at the Rajpath and see the water bodies which run right up to the fountains, and the two circles on the left and the right. This is before Rafi Marg got made. And here in the next slide, you see where Rafi Marg cuts through. This was a later change and addition to the Central Secretariat, which happened, I think it was after independence. But one of the very interesting things in this photograph, if you look very carefully on the right, just where Rafi Marg cuts to the circle, which is now near where Rail Bhavan is, there is a very, very large, possibly Lodi era tomb or early Mughal tomb. And it's a pretty big tomb because you can see the scale. And obviously this tomb was demolished. And I think it was demolished probably after independence when that road was cut. This is something that Swapna, etc., maybe you can check on the date of when this happens. But this is a structure that very few people know about. And it shows you how, that whole part of Delhi was filled with little ruins and little tombs and ruined mosques. Most homes had been kacha, so they didn't really survive, but certainly tombs, graves, and little mosques and sarais were scattered. Ruins of these were scattered throughout that area of Delhi. These are pictures taken by my father, who was a very, very good and serious photographer. And this is just, again, to put the context of what Delhi was. This is South Delhi towards the Qutub, near the Qutub. This is what the structure on the top right was known as Metcalfe's Folly. Metcalfe was living in the Qutub vicinity, in the compound, in an old tomb, besides the house that he had built in civil lines, not very far from me, along the Jamuna. This is, I think, must be in the late 50s. That's my sister on the right and my cousin Zarina on the left. And you see how barren this was. This is roughly from where Balban's tomb is, looking across at that structure. That structure was torn down under Rajiv Gandhi's time, and it was given to Jain Trust. This is the picture on the top, taken recently last year. You see the tomb on the left, and that Jain statue on the right is where the Metcalfe's Folly used to be. And this is what the street looks like now. This is just to give an idea of how Delhi has changed and evolved over these decades. This is looking the other way towards Balban's tomb. And again, see how totally barren, very few trees. This was the landscape of New Delhi at the time. That's, looking towards Mehrauli, the road turning around, going to Mehrauli. All of this, of course, much of this is now developed. And this arch in that garden, only one section, the left section of this arch remains. The rest has fallen down. 1953 is when my father and mother finally moved to Delhi, and they stay. This was quoting from the interview again. I was recruited directly into the CPWD as a senior architect and joined in February 1953. We spent 6 months in Constitution Club. There used to be a huge refugee market on the lawns of the Hexagon in front of Baroda House. Remember, this is very shortly after partition, and there are many, many thousands of refugees who have come from Punjab into Delhi, increasing the population of the cities in an almost catastrophic manner. There used to be a huge refugee market on the lawns of the Hexagon in front of Baroda House. The Pwd Dhaba there sold a big tandoori chicken for rupees 5. This market was demolished in 1955, and some of the shops, including Pindi's, were shifted to Pandara Road, which is where that Pandara market was built, and which, because of Pindi, has become the big foodie haven in Delhi now. From Constitution Club, we shifted to a flat in Sujan Singh Park. The flat overlooked golf links. The roads of golf links had been laid out, and 1 or 2 houses had already been built. But we could hear jackals howling from our balcony at night. Sundarnagar and Jorbagh were already fully developed, as they had been started off in the late 1940s. And in 1989, my father says that Jhabwala and Jugal Chowdhury would know the details of who designed and promoted these 3 private colonies. There's a lot more in here, but I won't bother you with the extensive details. I'm showing you this letter from 1953, which we discovered in the Le Corbusier archive in Paris. I did not know that my father had almost, when he came to Delhi, had gone up to meet Le Corbusier and Pierre Jeanneret in Chandigarh. And this letter was written by hand from Constitution House in 1953 on my mother's dance letterhead from Calcutta. And it's a fairly apologetic letter saying, at the same time, I feel very disturbed to think that you may have misunderstood my academic questions and arguments as being impertinent on my part. But I am confident that you have taken the questions and arguments of an eager and confused young architect in the true spirit of a great master and teacher. And then he invites him to come and have drinks and dinner with my parents in Delhi when he comes to Delhi. This is a photograph of Kingsway Camp to show you the refugee camp. This was 300,000 people living here at its peak. It was so large that families were separated on either side of the border would often find each other once they made it to the camp. Kingsway Camp was located where Guru Tegh Bahadur or GTB Nagar now stands. 1953 and 1954, Nehru was very concerned about this issue of both housing the refugees in Delhi and the whole question of housing in India, completely different from the British emphasis of building the imperial New Delhi, which they had finished only a few years before they were finally forced to leave because of course, the Second World War and that incredible independence movement, peaceful movement, which had been led by Gandhi and the Congress Party. So this was a big exhibition for housing, which the government of India held in 1954. And this is the cover of this exhibition souvenir. And this was Nehru's address at that at the time. The main thing today is that a tremendous amount of building is taking place in India, and an attempt should be made to give it a right direction and to encourage creative minds to function with a measure of freedom so that new types may come out, new designs, and new ideas. Another quote from this brochure: I have mentioned many matters which might appear to be beyond the scope of an exhibition on low cost housing, but I do not think they are outside their scope. A house is not merely a place to take shelter from the rain or the cold or the sun. It is, or should be, an enlargement of one's personality. And if human welfare is our objective, this is bound up with the house. Indeed, changes in housing in other parts of the world have affected social revolutions in the community. So you see the kind of thinking that a leader like Nehru had, and he was hugely concerned about urban development and architecture, as you will see over the course of this talk. This is a view of the exhibition which took place in the empty grounds next to the Purana Killa, which became Pragati Maidan, Trade Fair Grounds, and then Pragati Maidan. These structures, these houses were actually built as models, and engineers and architects came from all over India to present their designs and also to see other experiments which were being done, both for urban and rural housing. This was the gate to the exhibition designed by my father. In the back, you see Purana Killa, and on the left, you'll see artwork. Nehru was very insistent that artists should be given projects in all these public buildings in order to not only give them a little work, but to put their work in public space as public art. And the murals on these gates were done by Primoja Chowdhury and by Elizabeth Brunner, amongst other artists. I'm going to bring in a lot of names that people might have forgotten over the decades. This was the ticket booth, the entrance, and you see the very simple brick edging done, painted white along the street. I mean the grass over there. Simple but inventive, and design elements which are sort of Art Deco, modernist, very nice typography. This is 1954. This is the Pwd Delhi House in the brochure, with the photograph of the actual structure, a plan, and a complete cost breakdown, which was on the following page. So this was quite a remarkable exercise as an exhibition, and was trying to push this whole idea of low-cost public housing across the whole country. From these simple designs emerged these flats, which were designed by my father in what was recently named Netaji Subhash Nagar. This was R.K. Puram, Ramakrishna Puram at that time. These are very simple two-room apartments, pragmatically designed. But just take a look at how he uses brick and plaster-covered brick very simply, along with simple jali work. But you'll see in his work, like in the building in Calcutta, the new Secretariat, using elements of vertical definition to give a visual relief and an aesthetic structure to even simple structures, using depth, different colors, leaving brick red colored, the other work painted. Also, you'll see the projected chhajja on the top. This is something that he developed in Bengal because of the tremendous rain that he saw, and you'll see this in many buildings. It's an element that he thought was very practical for buildings in India, to let the water run off and run off from a distance from the facade so that it wouldn't streak the facade with mud and dirt. These were hugely successful flats. They were called the Rahman Flats. And this is shot 2 years ago when they were all being smashed and torn down to do a kind of development like you have seen in Kidwai Nagar in Delhi, where much of the land was actually also going to be given over to private enterprise. This is government land, and became very controversial because of the trees being cut down. And the funny thing is, when I went to see these being torn down, I realized how solidly they had been built. And there was very little sealan, etc. And actually, they were taking them quite a hard time to smash these by hand. So it was ironic, this generations of our bureaucrats have grown up in these flats, the Rahman type flats. This was a very important part of modernist practice that happened in Delhi. And it's very sad that even one unit was not preserved, like a little museum example, as they have done in the Bauhaus in Germany, etc. But this is the problem with our looking at modern heritage and not realizing what that heritage is about. This was another set of flats, larger flats. Again, you see the kind of rhythmic detailing that he loved to do with the chajjas, the recessed red brick, variation in jalis. Every unit building he did had different jalis in it. Coming to the Central Secretariat, this was built by Deolalikar. This is, of course, the National Museum, which was finished in 1954. And I'll read out his section on these buildings. Now, this is a very solid building, and this is, as you see, in red and buff sandstone. And Deolalikar takes off a little bit from Lutyens' vocabulary here, but then, becomes a little more Indian, if you can say, in this structure. And sadly, this is a building which is slated for destruction for this new development. And I just cannot understand why a building like this needs to be destroyed. It's totally functional inside and has hosted many fantastic exhibitions in the last few years. Okay, this is my father on the Central Vista. This is the building that you're seeing. The character of Central Vista began to change after independence. A popular boat club came up, which was enjoyed by young and old alike. But any such activity immediately gives rise to dhabas, and the crowds require toilet facilities. Deolalikar and then Gehlot prepared plans for toilets and restaurant facilities below the fountains at the Vijay Chowk end. I did photograph these. They are quite stunning, these toilets, still functioning and very much in the Lutyens mode, with using both marble and red sandstone. Their design included a set of cascades, and when construction was completed by 1955, the dhabas of the boat club were asked to relocate. The location of the restaurant proved unpopular, and the dhabas continue in what are now semi-permanent structures. These, of course, went long time ago. But even I remember those kebab walas as a kid, right near the Press Club of India. One set of underground toilets were also provided in the hexagon. The stone chain posts along Rajpath were once a lovely amber color, till Joglekar, who became the chief architect after Deolalikar, ordered them to be painted white. Nehru was disturbed by developments along Central Vista. My father had become quite close to Nehru by this time, partly because of his professional work, but he had got to know Nehru's sister, Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, quite well in New York in the 1940s. In fact, my father and mother met at a dinner that Mrs. Pandit had thrown in 1944-45 in New York when she was there at this stage where the League of Nations was going to become the United Nations after the end of the Second World War. Quoting here, Nehru was disturbed by developments along Central Vista. Deolalikar's bhavans did not appeal to him. Bilimoria's bhavans, which is this is Krishi Bhavan designed by Bilimoria, were under construction and Nehru was apprehensive. In those days, a national library and a national theatre were proposed along Central Vista. This was on the Janpath crossing. Rana's proposal, that's Man Singh Rana, the architect, Rana's proposals for the National Theatre were shelved and was later incorporated into the Indira Gandhi National Center for the Arts at that same site south of the National Archives. So Nehru set up a Central Vista Committee in 1959, a sort of mini art commission with Joglikar, Benjamin, Billy Moria, Kanvinde, Bijit Ghosh, and myself among the members. Meetings were chaired by Dharamveera, then Secretary, Ministry of Works and Housing. We could not succeed in improving Bilimoria's bhavans because Joglikar kept insisting that the designs were final and construction had started. The committee then turned down the proposal by Gill, another architect in PWD, and myself for extensions to the National Archives, which had been designed by Lutyens. This is why a competition was floated. After the Delhi House Commission was formed, of which my father was first secretary, the Central Vista Committee declined in importance, but it still exists and can put a spoke in the wheels of any Vista-related project, should any of its members be so inclined. I hear this has happened to the IGNCA. This is, of course, in 1989. I don't know what the status is now. But here is the Krishi Bhavan. This is a little bit going back to the PWD. New Delhi was built by the PWD. The achievements of Russell and Med, who held the post of chief architect to the government of India, need to be acknowledged. The first Indian to hold this post was Deolalikar from 48 to 52. Joglikar became chief architect in 1952 and presided until 1969, the longest term anyone has enjoyed. The decline in quality of government buildings owes a lot to Joglikar because he was zero as both architect and qualified planner. I chuckle when I read this. This is quite a frank interview. Between Joglikar and Yardi, the quality of government housing in Delhi suffered the maximum damage. Joglikar's talents as a planner are best exemplified by the layout for R.K. Puram. Yardi was given to making fundamental mistakes in design and detailing, which are unforgivable. An amusing and trivial example would be his provision of single door cupboards, which were fitted with inside bolts. These are just little details which are amusing. This building is one of the first buildings that my dad does, which is the University Grants Commission at the ITO area, finished in 1954. You can see the very pragmatic Bauhaus-inspired block building, but there's an attempt to give a texture to the front and to the sides with a interesting rhythmic square detailing. This is a much later picture where the color of the building has been changed, and you can see coming into the detailing here. Even on the facade of the stair, you can see instead of just a flat wall, there's a chamfered detail with little definitions, giving a visual break and rhythm to the building, and these projecting balconies with jalis on the side. And this is a photograph I took last year of the building as it is now. One of the sad things that's happened to many of these buildings is the change of color, and this kind of unified color that they've painted everything. It tends to distort the patterning and the kind of rhythmic facade. And here you can see the square blocks have been removed from this, so it's become a much simpler facade. Hold on, I'm just looking for a piece of paper. Yep, sorry, found it. That was the UGC building, which is 1954. And this is the Comptroller and Auditor General building in 1958. So you see what is happening here is all these buildings are being built for government functioning. The buildings that the British had built, South Block, North Block, were really imperial buildings and didn't have enough space for the new ruling bureaucracy which was being set up right after independence. So these buildings are pretty quickly built, but you see the wonderful rhythms and lines and detailing of the facade and entrance, completely modernist, completely different from the Delhi order of Lutyens and Baker. This is 1958. This is the side of the building. Again, you see the use of the recessed brick, exposing the structure, the concrete structure, which is coming out of Bauhaus philosophy to show the structure. Sunshades adapted for the Indian climate, but done with a little bit of play and fun, as you see on the left. And this is the building as it is now, shot last year. And you see, going back, the facade on the right and what has happened to it now, with this obsession by putting mirror glass, which is seen as a aspect of I guess what Modi would call iconic world-class modernity, even though this happened, I think, probably before he came into power. In the back is a later edition of my dad, the tall building, which was done in the 70s, also for the Comptroller and Auditor General. So this is 1958. These are wonderful murals done by a sculptor, ceramic murals on the side of the building. As I said, most of these buildings, Nehru had insisted that artists be used to decorate them. And these are almost very social, realistic, quite wonderful ceramic tile murals done by Mrs. Pandit, who was a terrific sculptor, lived up in the hills at the end of her life. This is on the road going towards the ITO bridge. These are all buildings in the ITO area. Nehru had designated this as an area for the income tax office, the UGC. UGC, of course, had been set up by Maulana Azad, and there's a much longer history coming up of Azad further in this talk. This is the AGCR, 1958, the Accountant General Central Revenue Office. The Comptroller and Auditor General, which you saw earlier, 1958, CAG, audits all government spending. And you've been reading recently about Modi's fund for this COVID crisis, PM cares, and it's just been announced that the CAG is not going to audit those funds. That's the building he sits in. That's just an aside. The AGCR building, 1958, which is still up there, hidden behind trees now, difficult to see. But look at the design vocabulary in this building. This is from the side. You can never see it. The Delhi Police headquarters is right next to this now. You see the play of the colors on the windows along the side edge of the building. Again, the very barren Delhi at that time. And on the top, you see the model of this building, and below the Accountant General building in Madras. Now, what was happening in Delhi, the CPWD in Delhi under my father and these other architects, it became like a factory for design, and buildings were being designed to be built all across India. This building was done in Madras, and you can see how it's a variation of the AGCR building in Delhi, but with a completely different play on the facade. Essential structure is the same, and probably the construction drawings for the interiors are probably exactly the same, but there's a whole different play on what is happening on the outside. And the long striped chhajjas you see on the building below, the Madras building, you'll see later on in Rabindra Bhavan. These are some details of the playful elements within these buildings. This is the first time that I'm showing a lot of this detail work instead of just a general narrative of which building was built when. These pictures, by the way, all mostly by my father, and they show his very Bauhaus aesthetic as a photographer. These are the two buildings, the UGC and the Controller Auditor General, taken at ITO many years ago. And this is the tall building done in the 70s with that cross structure on the edge. Those vertical lines, again, giving a rhythmic verticality, defining the vertical nature of this building with the play of light and shade. And this was a few years ago shot in color. I think I shot this. I shot many of these buildings for the collection at MIT when I was a student there myself in the 1970s. So many of the Delhi buildings of that period, slides are actually pretty well archived at the visual collection in the architecture department at MIT. This is 1955, and this is again a major building, which is the Daktar Bhavan for the Post and Telegraph office and the director of Post and Telegraph. Post and Telegraph was a hugely important part of the government of India, and because it was the major means of communication across India at the time. And this building was built on Patel Chowk. This is a terrific picture with my father on the left, showing the model to many senior Congress leaders. Of course, pointing down is Babu Rajendra Prasad, who was president at the time, a great Congress leader who was with Gandhi, the Champaran Satyagraha, Gandhi's first Satyagraha in 1917, if I remember. Yes, 1917. And I think that's Babu Jagjeevan Ram. So this is the great figures from our national movement who have joined the government under Nehru, Nehru being the leader of all of them. And this is the building as it got built. And here again you see that use of the vertical louvers, really giving a strong modernist statement. And this whole idea at the time was actually to give a kind of new vocabulary and a new vision for the new India, which was a democratic people's India, and these were buildings for the people. Post and Telegraph very much so, and UGC, of course. This is another view. Maulana Azad, who had set up the UGC and was planning the three academies of the arts. Azad was a great educationist, very, very important figure, who set up many institutions, including the IITs, which came up later. And he dies in the late 50s and is buried in front of the Red Fort in the very hallowed ground between the Red Fort and Jama Masjid, the old mosque, Shah Jahan's mosque. And my father was given the project to design his mazar, his tomb, based on what he had done for the Gandhi Ghat in Bengal, in Barakpur. So he came up with this very simple modernist structure, which is the arch was actually taken, the proportion of the arch was taken from the arch of the gate, the main gate of Jama Masjid, which you see in the back. But he made this thin shelled cross vault out of concrete. And my father, because he had studied engineering, knew how to use concrete very well and could work with the engineers in the PWD department, very, very well, and push them into areas where they may not have ventured before. This became a bit controversial with the Orthodox Muslim clergy in Delhi, who felt that this was not, traditional enough, but it was resisted by many people, including Nehru, who loved this design. And you see the Mughal Jali, there is a Mughal Jali at the bottom, along at the base of the structure. This became quite a very famous structure. And again, it was a structure that Nehru loved because he felt that it was expressing an Indian spirit, but in a completely modern vocabulary. This is another view. In 1959, there was a seminar on modern architecture at Jaipur House, and this was actually organized by Lalit Kala Academy, the three academies which had been set up by Azad before he had died. Sangeet Natak for dance and music, Lalit Kala for the fine and plastic arts, and Sahitya for literature. And I'll read what Amit Srivastava and Peter Scriver have to say about this. And it's amazing that this seminar happened with all the young architects attending. It was chaired, it was organized by Kanvinde, who can be seen sitting in the back of the table there behind Nehru, actually on the right side. And you see the audience in Jaipur House. Architects had come from all over India, including Charles Correa, who had recently just returned, also graduating from MIT. Kanvinde was directly a student of Walter Gropius, had come back to join the CSIR in 1948-49 and had built the first modernist building in Delhi, which was the CSIR on Rafi Marg, that same Marg which was cut across India Gate. This is in context of this seminar from the book by Peter Scriver and Ahmed. The political context of Nehru's remarks were passionately and somewhat less diplomatically revealed in a series of papers that were subsequently presented in response to one of the main issues that the symposium had been organized to address. That's the book you see there, the Seminar on Architecture 1959, which is signed by my father, July 16th, 1960. This was the question of a national policy on architectural expression, which had been recently mooted in Parliament. As Achyut Kanvinde, the official convener of the seminar, politely explained, in deference to the event's political patrons, the question of a national style simply did not occur to a committed modernist of the rationalist school to which he and my father, as an acolyte of Gropius, still adhered unequivocally at this stage of his career. The point was argued more bluntly by Pilu Modi, who had also studied in the US and, of course, later became probably better known as a politician, but was a hugely talented architect who was one of the team who designed the Oberoi Hotel in Delhi. The point was argued more bluntly by Pilu Modi, another putative leader of the profession, who would later enter national politics himself as a radical member of the parliamentary opposition. Architecture was a self-governing discipline that would not be dictated by some false ideal of a national style. A government policy on architecture was therefore to be resisted on principle, Modi argued. A policy towards architecture, on the other hand, could serve to cultivate a better understanding in government and society at large about what good design could deliver, unfettered by ignorant or arbitrary tastes. Indeed, if the government was serious about improving the standard of architecture, Modi quipped, it should begin by immediately doing away with the Public Works Department. My father couldn't have been very happy with that. But it's amazing that this was the kind of debate that was going on, given the kind of debate that we are seeing now, which is actually no debate at all. This was the Delhi Zoo, which was being designed by my father in 1957 onwards. And this is the entrance gate to the zoo. This was, of course, right in front of the Purana Killa, and had begun with a small collection of animals in makeshift cages, bears, monkeys, etc., which had been brought to this site. This site, again, was really decided by Nehru. But the amazing thing about this, again, looking across Delhi, is you see how little of Delhi has been built. There's the Akbar Mosque across the road from the Qila and the fantastic Sher Shah Suri Gate. In the back, you can see the dome of Jaipur House and India Gate. And way off in the distance, you see the domes of the Secretariat and Rashtrapati Bhavan. So this again shows you how totally depopulated and barren New Delhi was at the time. This was the entrance gate to the Delhi Zoo. And this kind of zigzag entrance was actually in deference to the parapets of the Purana Killa, which you see in the back. You can barely see the fort now because it's surrounded by very, very tall trees. The zoo was a huge public project, and Delhi had had no zoo before, and it was a national project. It's filled with little details like this, which I think are going to be lost very soon because it looks like they're going to build this into some sort of a Disney theme park, quite different from what it was originally intended to be. But this is a seating bench, another bench. You see the kind of vocabulary simply done with cast concrete, but full of high style. And this is the great engineer and architect and philosopher Buckminster Fuller with Joseph Allen Stein, the great American architect who also designed much of New Delhi and was very, very close to my father. They were kind of almost worked together and exchanged design ideas constantly in those years. And you see this very dramatic Purana Killa in the back. You can hardly see it like that nowadays. It's completely obscured by trees. This was the elephant umbrella done quite late, actually, in the early 70s by my father. Very simple concrete structure, but being very playful, which he loved to do, evoking the backs of the elephants. And this is to protect them from the sun. And this was shot just last year, and they still use it for sunshade, the elephants. This is the entrance gate as it looks now. And, you'll see a lot of these buildings, how they've been adapted with those strange tiles being put on the top. And of course, the whole front entrance has got these very crude, simple metal sheet, sunshades. This is the end of that entrance block as it is now. Now I'm going to show you a long series of pictures on a very important building in my father's career. And it really shows how Nehru had such a almost direct impact on where architecture was going. And this was a picture that I found with Sanjay Kanvinde in Kanvinde's office. And I was very surprised to find this because that's Kanvinde on the left in a tie. And of course, that's Nehru on the right. And I was startled to see this picture because I recognized the model. 1961 May was going to be Rabindranath Tagore's birth centenary. And of course, Nehru had been very close to Tagore, and Tagore had been a huge influence on the culture and philosophy, followed by many leaders and writers, poets, theater people involved in the national movement of various colorations. And Nehru wanted to build centers, art centers. This was part of his project of building the new India. In every state capital of India, there was going to be a Rabindra Bhavan. And of course, Delhi's one was going to be the most important. And a piece of land was given on Mandi House, opposite what was the Nepal embassy, for this building. And this is the model of the building my father had come up with, this very Bauhaus kind of block structure. And see Nehru's face. He hated the building. And the thing with Nehru was, he was a very passionate man. And when he got angry, he would get really angry and snap at people. But of course, the anger would go away very fast. But he would express himself, which he did with my father. And my father, came back home absolutely trembling, thinking I'm going to lose my job. Because he said, what is this building? It looks like, your Controller and Auditor General building. It has nothing to do with culture. It has nothing to do with the spirit of Tagore. And, he said, you've done the Azad Tomb, you've done Gandhi Ghat, you can do it. Why can't you make a building like this? And my father said, I've never done a institutional building with that kind of vocabulary or style. So Nehru pushed him into making, this is another view of that building, of the original design. And you can see how this evolved later on into what became the WHO building, which you'll see later on. So this is what the plans ended up becoming, really goaded and pushed by Nehru. And this is May 1961, where my father is at the inauguration of the Rabindra Bhavan Gallery, is showing Nehru the details, the final details of the plan and the functions of the building, the main building housing the three academies, and then the exhibition block. And on the top, you see the model for the theater, which never got built. And that open land is what Al-Qazi used later on for his National School of Drama to make an open-air theater, which was also designed by my father. So this became a completely different building for my father. And he said later on that this was the first building where he could escape from the influence of Oscar Niemeyer, and that this building truly belonged to India. And here you see the stylized arches at the bottom, the extensive use of jari, red brick, the overhang chhajja, which I told you was practical development, but also an aesthetic development with this sort of floating roof slab above the building. And on the top is a drawing of the academy buildings, the developed elevation. And you see a plan here. Now, what happened is you saw that big tomb which had been torn down to put Rafi Marg across the Rajpath crossing. Here, there was in the middle of this site, there was a small ruined mosque and a set of graves. And you see it on the drawing here where it says a monument once stood here. The two buildings were separated because of this, because this was a rough patch of ground which was not disturbed, was not disturbed, because of course you wouldn't dig up graves or destroy the little remnant of a mihrab of a mosque. So the exhibition block was on one side and the administration block on the other with the covered walkway. This design, by the way, there was an insight by K.T. Ravindran that this design actually inspired Stein to develop this almost similar pattern for the India International Center, which was being done just a little bit after this building. And, Stein and my father were very close. So that land was left in its natural state between the two buildings. This is another drawing of the elevation. It used to be called Lytton Road. And this is a view of the exhibition block. And you see the Lutyens, chains, and bollards, which used to run all over New Delhi. But this is how the building was designed to be seen. It was not designed to be behind big walls or covered by trees, which is what it is now. And here you see the detailing that he developed, and this is under the goading of Nehru. These jalis were done for Rabindra Bhavan. The hexagonal jali became quite famous. You saw it in buildings which were then coming up in golf links and defense colony, etc. Here a detail. You see these chamfered details which begin to happen. You don't get a simple column, but you're getting a chamfered detail of columns which use natural light and play to give a definition to the surface. The jalis on the top, the hexagonal ones, are against brick, so they're not see-through. It's a texture of a facade. This was a review in The Statesman, a truly excellent gallery, far better than any we have ever seen anywhere in India. This, of course, became very important because generations of Indian modernists showed at this gallery in Rabindra Bhavan. This is from the interior, showing the fenestration. You see on the right, you see the rough ruins, the rocks of that patch of land. And there was a big battle I had later on when this was dug up under Ashok Vajpayee when he was secretary. And Sudhakar Sharma, there was a big, huge battle I had with the two of them about what they were doing to the building. They removed this fenestration and put sheet glass. This is again a question of heritage in modern buildings, and how do you restore them, or how do you preserve them, and how do you alter them without really destroying the whole character of and vocabulary of the building. This was the interior, and this is finished in 1961, as I said, and this is still one of the best gallery spaces in India. And you see that flying spiral staircase going up to the second floor. Look at the detail and proportions of the handrails, all very carefully done. Look at the lamps. These are handmade lamps. These two cores were designed for air conditioning to come later on because there was no money for air conditioning at that time. Another view from the other side. And a view looking up the spiral staircase to the mezzanine floor, which had an open section looking down on the staircase. And those white bands you see on the top, there was a northern skylight, which brought all these galleries, by the way, if you look back, you see the skylights on the top edge running along. All the galleries, both upstairs and downstairs, had running skylights to let natural light come in also, along with artificial lighting. And sadly, the picture on the left shows what the upper gallery used to look like with that skylight. And on the left corner, you see light coming in through, peeking in through the skylights above the display wall areas. And on the right is what the gallery became under Vajpayee and Sudhakar Sharma. Completely blocked in, losing all sense of the kind of space that the gallery had, sealing the skylight for what reason, I don't know. They ripped up the perfectly good terrazzo tile floor and put in this very cheap wooden veneer, which is not very sturdy and not very good for heavy sculpture. Anyway, this is the disaster of adapting modern buildings. On the right, you see the edges, the ends of the academy buildings, and this stonework and that chamfer, that angle was really inspired by the Tughlaq period buildings, which are all around Delhi. And every Sunday, my father and us as a family and the Steins as a family would drive to all these ruins and sit and have a light picnic and examine the construction and detailing of those buildings, and they really came to love them very strongly. So this is a kind of a salute to Tughlaq buildings in Delhi from my father. And you see the use of the different colored quartzite stone, which is a kind of rhythm of its own. And the brick that was used on these buildings is a fire brick. And you see those sweeping chhajjas, which he first used in the Madras Auditor General building. When my father died in 1995, that's a picture that I took of him on his deathbed. He died under a photograph, that big photograph of Rabindra Bhavan, because he saw this as a game-changing building in his design philosophy. And on the left, which was many years earlier, this is the photograph my father took from the top of the School of Planning and Architecture at ITO of Nehru's funeral. Nehru, for both my parents, was almost like a god. He was a hugely inspirational figure whom they had become close to. But I found this picture very interesting because in the back, you see two of his buildings. Way in the back, the WHO building had been completed and had been inaugurated by Nehru. And in the foreground, you see the Indraprastha Bhavan, income tax office building being built. And the little white dome that you see in the middle there is Achyut Kanvinde's, I'll point it out with this. This is Kanvinde's CSIR building, which you'll see later. That's the WHO building there, and this is Indraprastha Bhavan. And the Nehru's cottage here is body covered in flowers. 1961, this was a private commission, which my father was not supposed to do, but this was done for a friend. This is the first 70 millimeter movie theater ever built in India. This is the Sheila Theatre in Paharganj, which sadly is also due to be torn down as it is no longer feasible to run a single screen theater. And given the situation we are in right now with this COVID virus, I don't think movie theaters are going to open for a very long time. But here you'll see design elements coming from Rabindra Bhavan, which is being built at the same time. Using the structure here, that's the seating of the movie theater. You're seeing the underneath, but it's being used as a design element in the lobby. And the wonderful and bright colors that were used, this was, of course, a building not for official use, but for entertainment. So my father could have fun. And he got a very young Canadian architect who had come to Delhi and was roommates with John Bissell, who was setting up Fab India at the same time. That mural was done by Luc Durand, who came back to India a few years ago. He's now passed away, lived in Montreal. But the building has been very well preserved by the family, the Kaushik family, who owns the theater. This is the outside, the facade of the theater. The staircase inside, you see the wonderful play that he's having with color and with space. And these are drawings of the facade I recently found, pencil drawings, and on the right is a detail of the facade as it ended up being built. So this building for young architecture students is still there, and it's very much visitable. It's just next to the big flyover over the rail tracks, the bridge over the rail tracks in Paharganj. This is 1965. The building is finished in 1965. You saw it being built, the ITO building. Again, a building which is a Y-shaped block, and then a separate, what my father called the drum-shaped block, which is still called the drum-shaped block at ITO. He did a number of buildings in ITO, many of which still stand, and 2 or 3 of which have now been torn down. This is a picture my father took from Kanvinde's CSIR building. You saw that white dome in the earlier picture, and that's the white dome here of the theater. And in the back, you see my father's Indraprastha building being finished. And I love this picture because they're both students of Walter Gropius, and both built buildings about 1 decade apart. CSIR had been built in the 50s, and this one in my father's in the 60s. But I think it's a wonderful example of 2 architects using different vocabulary. A little Kanvinde was forced to be a little more decorative in the CSIR building, and he had issues with that, which Sanjay has talked about in the wonderful book that he has done on his father. But you see these very clean lines that my father was using, and you see the detail, the edges of those columns, the vertical columns are not plain, they're slightly chamfered, again using that light and shade to give texture and volume and play. And you see the pillars, the columns at the base, they're no longer either just round or square or rectangular, but they have a chamfer. They're like, little pieces of sculpture holding up the building. So this is an office, this is a government office building, but done, in high style. And I love the man in the dhoti walking in, probably a construction worker, in contrast to this very modernist structure you see sweeping above him. Hussain did a mural on this building on the left, but it hadn't been done at this point as yet when these pictures were taken. And this is the inside staircase. It's a double spiral. It's not quite a double helix. It's a double spiral staircase, very playful, inventive, going up the center of the Y-shaped building, which has a huge skylight on the top. And hard to imagine a government building done with this kind of style nowadays. This was the WHO building, which was finished 1963, just down the road from the Indraprastha Bhavan. And again, very clean lines, very interesting structure, sadly torn down last year. There's a conference hall block on the right and the office block on the left. And as my father very proudly said, he said that there was almost nothing imported in this building except for some telephones. Remember, this is a time when we had very limited fixtures being manufactured in India. Hinges, door handles, etc. were quite scanty at the time. This is another view of the building. When I was asked to come and see the building and give them some material, they told me they were going to tear it down because it was not earthquake proof, which is a good excuse to tear down a building because the land that the building is on is more valuable now. And the 2 Hussain murals which were done in the conference hall, they claim that they have rescued those. So the murals are more important than the building. And this is another view. So these are, these institutions show you the aspiration for the new democratic India. And that democratic is very important because this is that was very much the ideal in these office buildings, that they, exemplify non-imperial, non-fascist, and really a democratic aesthetic and ideology. And this was the tearing down of the back, which had been built very bad copy of what my father had done. This was being torn down. But strangely, in the back, you see the DDA building, which I'll talk about later, which was also my dad's design, and a little bit of the drum-shaped building on the corner on the left. Over here is the drum-shaped, and there's the DDA. So these three. This building, of course, is no longer there, the WHO. That's the building being torn down. I went to the gate and snuck a couple pictures before guards chased me off. This was last year. So this is sadly, the fate of much modernist building, a tradition of which Delhi had quite a remarkable set of buildings and a remarkable history. And this is what is going to come up in its place. I don't know who the architect is. There's been no public debate about this. This is 1965, the External Affairs Hostel on Curzon Road, now called Kasturba Gandhi Marg. And this was a building, 2 small rooms to house the members of our diplomatic corps who were coming back on posting to Delhi before they given a bigger flat. So this was a kind of literally a hostel to accommodate them in the middle of their transferring and relocation to Delhi. And you can see very strongly his design vocabulary here. This is the back with these arched verandas. And also 1965, when planning rules were changed, these were the first tall buildings, apartment buildings to come up in Delhi. And at that time, these 8-floor buildings were very radical in Delhi. And here you see with the construction labor as these buildings were being finished. Now, the innovation here was this staggered balconies, which actually were inspired by Walter George and Sujan Singh Park, according to my father. Walter George had not done staggered balconies like this, but my father admired the height and the verandas and balconies that Walter George had in Sujan Singh Park because they were very suited to our climate. And in those days, Delhi was not as humid as it is now, and we used to sleep out on these verandas. Again, you see the proportions and the alignments, the use of jalis, very clean lines. This is a photograph by Madan Mahata of the same set of buildings which had come up in R.K.Puram. They painted rather hideous colors right now, and all in one color. So this kind of definition and structural definition of the buildings is completely gone. And interestingly, for young people who don't remember, you see those tree guards in the front. Those are used oil drums, tar drums, which were used to make the asphalt for paving all the roads. And this is how we grew up. And all the trees you see in Delhi, all were protected by these tar drums from the cows and the other animals, to eat them. So that's a bit of cultural history there. Details, photographs done by my father. And that's the one block that we used to live in on the top floor there, which was on Shah Jahan Road. One, which was a 6-story one, which was built on Shah Jahan Road. (1967), a very big complex right behind Lutyens' Baroda House. This was where my father and mother and sister lived when they first came to Delhi. This was Constitution House, which were British barracks. The barracks were finally torn down in the mid-60s, and these buildings came up very fast, 6 blocks, for the UNCTAD conference, which was to happen in 1967. And again, these are very small 2-bedroom flats. a corridor on one side, which leads to the flats on the other side. But they were quite successful. And of course, all these flats had lifts. This was the clubhouse. You see the highly stylized cantilevered stairs with a reflecting pool at one end of the complex. Very high style with that chamfered jali. Structural, really playing. Many architects in Delhi actually, I mean, I could do a whole exhibition just on staircases done by architects in the 60s and 70s. It's a fantastic theme because they had more fun doing staircases than the actual buildings. This is the same stair. And that in the center is the stair as I found it a few years ago. It's like what happened to Rabindra Bhavan. And in this case, I call it the Karol Baghification of this modernist structure, because it looks like a sari shop with those terrible handrails and, the stair completely infilled and all that style completely gone. This is also Curzon Road Hostels. This was the play of the balconies. At that time, every building had a different treatment of the balconies. And this is what they look like now. Adaptation again. This again was an outside commission. This was done for Chatterjee and Polk. This is the Hindustan Times office building also on Curzon Road, Kasturba Gandhi Marg now. This is a most amazing shot done by the great Madan Mahata, who is also a very dear friend of the family and my father. This picture almost makes New Delhi look like New York. But here you can see how he developed the lines from that new Secretariat building. These very clean vertical lines defining the height of that tower, inspired by some American buildings possibly, but really using the vocabulary that he developed. The lower part of the building used to be the printing press. I'm not sure that it's still there now. And this was the DDA tower. This was a building which he had designed in 1966, 1967. And this was the tallest building in Delhi at the time, with an interesting structural system in concrete. And on the right, you see the drawings that I recently found of the facade treatment. This building was taken away from my father, and the facade was completely changed and made very simple, straightforward. So it lost on the detail. On the right, you can see the kind of treatment he had given, which would have made the building look completely different and it would have had a different rhythmic style. This is 1973. This is Patel Bhavan, opposite from his GPO, which had been built in the 1950s. Again, very clean lines, but using these curved features mirroring the Gol Chakkar of Patel Chowk, in the middle of which stands the statue of Sardar Patel. Details of that building. This was one of the last of the large office buildings that my father did. This building now is, I think, the head office for Ajit Doval. And of course, there's no way that anyone can go into this now. And this building, this was the office building for the Trade Fair Authority, which was built in 1972 at the same time as the great Hall of Nations done by Raj Rewal, and many, many other buildings in Pragati Maidan done by a whole generation of modernist architects. On the corner on the left, you can see the Hall of States, actually, one of the smaller buildings peeking through. And I must say I had a hand in this building because this was when I was in modern school, finished in 1973. But my father would discuss designs with both my mother and me at the dining table or lunch table. His office was very nearby, so he would come home every day for lunch from Nirman Bhavan, which was a Billimoria design. And I had seen the Rival's Hall of Nations coming up. So I told my father, I said, why don't you use a design, a grid design like this, which I sketched out. And I said, as a kind of, tribute to Rival's building, so that there's a kind of harmony in the buildings. And he actually did that. Sadly, this building has also been torn down now, along with everything else in Pragati Maidan. And coming back to tombs, given the fact that my father was anti-religious, he ended up making quite a few tombs. This was in Jamia. This is the tomb of Dr. Zakir Hussain, who again was a hugely important figure in the national movement and important educationist with a long history which goes to the Aligarh Muslim University, etc. So this tomb was designed by my father in Safdarjung Hospital, where he was recovering from a very bad spinal injury in 1970. And this has, you see this rough cut marble facing of these sloping walls, again inspired by Tughlaq architecture. Very simple jalis inserted in between. And it's in a sunken circular garden area. And lastly, in the later 70s, this was the tomb for Fakhruddin Ali Ahmed, the president, former president of India, which is right next to Parliament House. There's a mosque that Fakhruddin Ali Ahmed used to go and do his namaz in, a small old mosque. This is just outside in the garden next to the mosque. And this is an interesting, structurally very interesting tomb because it's the internal structure is stainless steel. And my father designed these C-shaped sections which fitted the stainless steel column from two sides and got pinned together. And this is an open to the sky tomb, which is inspired by the tomb of Muhammad Shah Rangila and Jahanara in the Nizamuddin Dargah, both of which are open to the sky tombs. And he did, again, a playful and inventive jali. These are modern jalis. They're not traditional jalis. Here is a detail of the jali and of the tomb. And Begum Abida Ahmad was also buried here when she passed away. And I'm going to end by showing a number of other buildings which have been demolished or are being demolished. This is Vanu Bhuta's Fiki building under destruction. It is now completely demolished. This is in Mandi House. This housed the Natural History Museum, and there had been a fire, but I'm pretty sure that the fire didn't damage this structurally enough to destroy the entire building. This was shot last year or 2 years ago. And this was in Pragati Maidan, great exhibition hall done by Joseph Allen Stein on the right. This also was destroyed, as you see on the left. Stein had these incredibly innovative dome structures, which he used in many of his buildings, including the American School in Chanakyapuri and in the escorts factories, which he had built in Faridabad. And sadly, this was a pretty amazing building, which could easily have, again, been adapted to any modern use. But given the ideological times that we are living in, it was sought to be destroyed with no debate, no public discussion whatsoever. And this, of course, is the great, great tragedy of the Hall of Nations, which I had tried, I had fought quite valiantly to make a public issue of this and try and save this as modern heritage, but it didn't happen. And that's it. I think I will end over here. And I hope I haven't bored all of you to death. It's been an hour and a half, just about. And again, thank you, Annabelle and Swapna, for asking me to do this. And I've tried in this talk to give much more detail and show many pictures which I've actually never shown in public before. And I hope you have all got something out of this. And I'm going to sign off. Jai Hind.